Welcome everybody. Oki Naganago Mekoche Chestakom Aki De Kots Nagotine Siku. My name's Michelle Robinson. I use she and her pronouns. We're here on Blackfoot Confederacy. We're here on Treaty 7, and I want to acknowledge the Blackfeet south of the imposed U.S. Canadian border. North of the border are the Siksika, Kainai, and Bagani. I want to acknowledge in 1877, Treaty 7 was signed with the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Wesley, that's the Good Stony, Chiniki, Bearspaw nations of the Stony, and the Tsuut'ina, the Dene. I try not to show favoritism because as a Satu Dene, those are my cousins. But I want to acknowledge all First Nation, Métis, Inuit status and non-status across Turtle Island as the keepers of these lands, all non-Indigenous or treaty partners with government sending on your behalf. And so we'll start that way. And I'm honored to have this book club. One of our members, Rosemary, suggested this book and a while ago, and I'm really glad she did because this has been on my to-do list, and I'm really excited to talk about doing things the right way. Dene Traditional Justice in the Northwest Territories, written by Joan Ryan. Now, I did look it up, and it looked like she was non-Indigenous.
Yeah, she's non-Indigenous.
Yeah, so there is a bit of that lens here, but it's still a really great book. And I wanted to thank you, Rosemary, for suggesting this book, and we'll go from there. So I don't know if everybody wants to do a round of introductions, but more so because so this is being recorded on May 13th. This is the Monday after the Thursday event, and that happened at the University of Calgary. That was very violent. They attempted to put up a camp and got very violent very quickly. And so a lot of the members here are actively involved in that and maybe a bit traumatized. I will also speak for myself and say it was really upsetting for me to watch people I know and love sometimes disagree with, because that's what family does. Like get the crap beat out of them and have goose eggs on their face, and that's not okay. So it's hard to see my friends taking rubber bullets and getting beat up by the police. And any good work I think that has been done over the last 10 years has been erased in one action just like that. For me, well, that's not true. It's like I don't like what they've done to Adora. I don't like what they've done to Taylor McNally. I support Stop the Stack YYC. So if you are listening in from abroad, you've heard on my podcast me talk about Stop the Stack YYC, and I think it's important that we support justice for Palestinians here in Calgary and independent Jewish Voices Calgary as well. And the Reconciliation Action Group put out a great statement. So very honored and proud of all the folks that worked on that. And so when we are literally talking about Dene traditional justice and what a very, very different way of doing things. So let's start there. And so I want to invite, I'll just open it up. I think I'm the only Indigenous person here today. So we'll just open it up we'll go Rosemary, Kat, Marla, and Samantha.
Is this to introduce ourselves, Michelle, or talk about the book?
Let's talk about the book. And okay. If you want to introduce yourself, you're more than welcome to. Yeah.
Well, I'll just say I'm Rosemary Brown, a white settler. I'm glad I hope you liked the book. And yes, Joan Ryan was a white settler. She was my thesis supervisor actually at U of C, and she's an applied anthropologist. And she also was very involved in the Berger pipeline hearings, working, how can I put it, like taking all her skills and working with community, right, to raise their voices. And she was such an advocate of participatory action research. And there was another project she worked on in the north. I think it was within the Gwich'in, and it was to recover information about traditional ways of doing things in terms of harvesting, plant gathering, hunting, trapping, snaring, customs, etc. And again, that was done because the community wanted it. So she was very much about taking her skills and making them available to the community. And she also did tons of work in solidarity with the Lubicon Nation in Northern Alberta. I'm not going to say she was perfect, but I think she really operated out of a sense of ethics, right? And respecting community.
So Rosemary, just to kind of give a time frame, that would be like from the 70s to 80s up to the 90s.
Yeah, right through. I mean, she died. I'm trying to remember. She died quite a few years ago now.
I think it said 2005 or 3
Yeah,
in
yeah,
either Googled her or something, and she
yeah,
had, yeah.
yeah. But she was active, you know, as much as she could be right up until the end. And one thing I do remember is that with the Gudgeon project, there was some sociologist at the university had a participatory action research conference. He was really puffed up about it, right? She had to fight tooth and nail to get him to not just have her present, but to fly down 2 members of the community who had been intricately involved in doing the research. You know, and that was what the participatory action should be about, right? The community and community ownership and community involvement. And I mean, and they were incredible speakers. So, I mean, she wanted them to speak. She didn't want to be the professor presenting, you know, all this stuff. So,
yeah.
Anyway, and then as you know, the book isn't available online. Kat kindly sent me the overview. And also I looked up a few other things online. And I think it's so important for us to understand how sophisticated, right, these traditional justice systems were in terms of how they were developed, how they were transmitted, how they operated. And I think because again, you know, in terms of white supremacy and European attitudes, right, that wouldn't even enter into people's minds that there was a traditional Indigenous system of justice or that it would have any relevance to today. And I must say, in the overview, they talked about the fact that, you know, as it existed in the past, it might not apply directly to some of the issues that arise today, but the values associated, right, with that system could very much be applied. And I tried looking up and seeing if there were any discussions about what's going on now at Lac La Martre in terms of justice. I don't know. I'm hoping someone else might know, and that's all I want to say.
You know, Rosemary, I did a lot of Googling for that reason because I'm like, it's not that it seemed out of date. It's just that, you know, obviously it was, and it was pre-TRC and such. So, like, you know, when I read a book like this and I see the language, like I can almost date it just based off of the language it kind of uses and the way it has to talk about Indigenous people. So, and of course, it doesn't really say Indigenous in here. It's either Aboriginal or
Right,
Dene, right? Like it's just
right.
because of that language again, right? So I tried to look and I couldn't find a lot of information either. So and kind of back to what you were saying about how she tried to do the best she could. I mean, we are talking about a time in Canada when there wasn't much for Indigenous funding, and it certainly wasn't going to go to an Indigenous person anyway. So at least she tried to use her power, privilege, prestige, and university funding and able to try to have this conversation. So, and I do think of like Patrick Deranger, the late Patrick Deranger. He said to me, you know, Michelle, you, and this was just recently, like he passed away a couple of years ago, but he had said to me within the last 10 years that, you know, you guys just have the language. We couldn't even articulate it and aim the human rights issues that they were trying to that they were facing, that they were trying to work within, right, these systems. So and so I kind of like the gaps that are kind of set in this book are, I think, kind of addressing those things. Like we just didn't have the language at that time.
Mhm.
So anyway, I did try to look it up, but I think it was just kind of those, this is like a small little pocket of university funding that was, that this was the only way we're all able to ever know about it. So that was just kind of the impression I got, just to kind of add to
Mhm.
what you're saying. I hope it feels like I'm adding to what you're saying.
Mhm.
Sure. All right. So Kat.
Would you mind stopping recording for a second?
Absolutely.
A technical question out.
No, I appreciate everything that you do, Kat. And here's another example of you trying to be such a good ally and work with disabilities and ableism, etc. And I honestly, you and I should tag team and just read to each other, record it, and then give it to anyone who needs to hear it. Because unfortunately, some of these older books, they don't have audios, right? And so if we can make that happen, just to help with people who want to know and want to learn, right? And or like Rosemary knows, and she's aware of this book and long before that, but just for others who might be interested. So I appreciate that, Kat.
Not a problem, because I also run a book club, and which Rosemary is, I'm grateful she's part of that too. And sometimes I have books that are not on audiobook too. So I want to make sure that everyone can participate. Anyway, I love this book too. I was a little concerned when I read it was participatory action research, because of the last book was not as successful. And we didn't really have a good response to that book. But this book, it seemed a lot more thorough, a lot more involved with the community, and a longer process. I loved reading about the rules that Denny came up with for their community, that were spiritual, that concerned, the spiritual world, the natural world, and the human world, keeping everything in balance with each other, and how that was essential for their way of life. And I don't really think of it. Anyway, yes, I liked this. I liked reading it. And lots about the non-Dene way of doing things, and why couldn't they do why couldn't the Dene go back to their own system? It would seem pretty easy, actually. Well, not easy, but it would seem doable, given the fact that the Dene should just, or non-Dene should just pull their little paws out of everything.
Yeah,
Let
no
people
kidding.
just get on with living.
Yeah.
Sorry, that I wasn't very eloquent. So anyway.
No worries, Kat. Absolutely no worries. I just wanted to let everyone know we're welcoming a new member. I did speak to them this weekend, as well as their parents. So welcome you. Definitely, you're welcome to just listen in, and just know for the folks that are here, definitely a safe person that I trust. So just wanted to let you know. And Marla, would you like to chime in at all and talk about this book?
Thanks, Michelle. I always appreciate Rosemary and Kat when you come, because you have such good perspectives. I enjoyed this book too, although I have to say I was uncomfortable when she would talk about the issue of alcoholism and alcohol abuse in the community. I really struggled with, and not actually the fact that you preface this, Michelle, with the time that this was happening in the community, and where kind of conversation or not was at in like the broader Canadian context. Well, really probably wasn't at all, really. So that does definitely put things into perspective, but it did make me think, oh my gosh.
So can you see now, and I'm just going to put this out there, like I was born in 1977, and I would say it wasn't until about 2005 that you would start to see more, more conversation about the why, about colonial trauma, about the lack of cultural, because like I believe that culture is prevention, and that's been part of the white bison society for years, for decades, and yet that wasn't in mainstream, right? It was just like, oh, these dumb little Indians have a drinking problem, not, hey, we came in here and genocided a ton of them. We stole their land, took their culture, took their language, took their kids, and geez, they have addiction issues. I wonder, like that there was no conversation about colonial trauma being the root of the problem and colonialism in general, right? So of course all of that context is missing, and she doesn't quite get it or grasp it or articulate it or put it in context either. So like it's hard, because like in one way we need to talk with elders, and actually I have a family member that's listed in the very start. And so when I went through this, and I was like, I never got to know this family member, I just know of them, right? Like so my granny, who just passed away a year ago, she was the child with these two folks, and my great grandfather had three wives, and so this is one of the kids from the other marriages. So and I mean kids, I mean he's 90 years old, I think, in the book. So just to give perspective here. So this is my family member that I don't really know, that I just know I'm related to George Blondin and the Blondin family through the marriages prior to that. Anyway, so it's it's hard, because like at that time that this book was even written, we weren't even naming Indian residential school as a solid reason for colonial trauma. It was still looked upon like, we just tried to help those Indians, like that type of messaging was said to me my entire life. So really, that healing journey that I've been on has been really quite recent, with an understanding of what colonialism, colonial trauma, and an understanding of why all of these problems really do exist. And this list of things about the Indian Act and the TRC in front of me that are, the guiding reasons. Okay, now it all makes sense why it is we're here as a society. But this book, of course, it doesn't give any of that context, because it just hadn't been really named yet, so yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for that. I think I think the interesting thing though is that I still, as you delve further into the book, and like I appreciated the time that she took to kind of explain participatory action research, right? Like the time that's involved, and doing it in, a good way, and trying to, bring community members in, and the stories are theirs, and give them, training on like the technology, and when she
Oh,
got into
you know
like
what? This would have been pre-internet too.
oh, I never thought about that.
Yeah,
Wow.
because
Yeah,
we're all that age. We remember when the internet came.
right. Yes. But I thought that was interesting to kind of think about, just how much effort was put in, knowing that it wasn't like a ton of money that she had to put towards it, and some of the compromises that had to be made in terms of moving from one-on-one interviews to group style, but still kind of confirming that with the community that they were okay with this way of proceeding. And so I found all that quite interesting. And you know, I mean, it's funny, she uses exclamation marks every now and then to make points, and it was I felt like that was so cute. Like she's kinda, this is the way we did it anyway, and no matter what, and we got through it. And sometimes I felt like I was reading like a friend's research or something. So it seemed a bit tongue in cheek or humorous a little bit at times. But I really liked the three examples that she gave. around like offenses that happened in the community, and then how they came together and decided what the solution should be. And then like really drawing out, like, this is specifically how this relates to kind of Dene justice, right? So I thought that was really informative, and that would be a good thing to share with people. Yeah, now I kind of lost my train of thought. Hang on.
It's like, though, wouldn't it be great if we could redo this book and update it to today's standards and
Yeah.
language? And, because now, I mean, we're talking 25 years of, being able to really articulate what we've articulated in 25 years. So,
yeah, and she was really probably at the forefront of this kind of, sort of changing the dynamics of what that conversation is about. And yeah, then her, Kat, what you were talking about too, spiritual rules. And I know very little about other Indigenous communities. I will say I know a little bit about, Blackfoot ways of doing and their, natural laws. And so it's just made me reflect on the traditions that people assume were never there. And yeah, these rules. Oh, I also thought it was interesting, like, she was making the differentiation between rules and laws so it wouldn't get confused. But I was like, just call them laws. I mean, that's what really, it was a justice system. So anyway, semantics, right? A little bit. But I enjoyed this book. I think yeah, kind of moving past that discomfort around like alcohol abuse. But the overall, oh, sorry, that was my cat feeder.
all good. We
Okay,
didn't hear
good.
it. Zoom is really good at filtering out. So like even my
good.
own dogs, they will bark and people won't even really know or hear it as well. Like my big dog, obviously, but like I have this little one, he's just been barking at the back because he's like, it's treat time. It's treat time. How come I'm not getting on my treats? But nobody can hear it. So don't worry about that.
Right. Okay, good. Okay, good. Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, overall, I quite enjoyed this book. And I really like, sort of the practical, like, examples of seeing what is actually going on in community and thinking about that whole, when she referred to sort of that whole interruption of colonialism and what could it look like for them to take that back. That would be such an interesting conversation to be like, to sit around the table with elders and community and how, hear what they have to say. And that's what I was most curious about. Where are they now? Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you. I'm just going to let both of our guests know, Samantha and our other guest. I don't know if you want to engage. I can pause it. So we try to create a safer space. So if you're uncomfortable, I can pause the recording, and then that way you can speak freely and introduce yourself in your way if you'd like to, or if you feel comfortable just talking about the book. If you got an opportunity, please don't hesitate.
Hi, Michelle and everyone. I'm Samantha. I'm a white settler. I'm recovering from a concussion, so I didn't get a chance to read the book, but I look forward to listening to it. Thank you very much, Kat. And I find that even just listening to your reflections, I pick up quite a bit of information that stays with me, and then I apply to the audio recordings and books that I am listening to of, a variety of subject matter that does end up being related. So I'm making connections right now to different podcasts, and I'm listening to White Fragility right now. So I'm making connections, but to this specific book, I don't have any comments on yet.
Sure.
Yeah.
And if you, as we're talking, if you feel like you want to chime in, please don't hesitate. You're more than welcome to. And our other guest I know is kind of in the same position. So I don't know if you would like me to pause it. Don't hesitate to comment because you already have. You're more than welcome to comment in the chat if you'd like me to pause it and have you introduce yourself at all. Or if you want me to just keep recording, you're more than welcome to. So I just don't want you to feel excluded. And both of you, actually, everybody's welcome to unmic themselves and just chat with me. For folks that are listening to my podcast and are first hearing about this book, Doing Things the Right Way by Joan Ryan. This was written, geez, I keep saying, this was written in 1995. So to give perspective, 1995, I had just graduated the year before from high school, and the residential school system was just kind of coming to an end. And I didn't go to residential school. I went to Sylvan Lake. I went to a white school, and so because my father is white, and so I ended up being raised by him. So this book is written by a university professor at the time, Joan Ryan, and some of the things that she puts in this book is doing things the right way, the way you were taught. And I thought might read a little bit of it for folks. Family rules for living together, living politically according to Dene ways, using the past to build a better future, taking back control, 3 case examples, conflicts between Dogrib and non-Dene justice systems, conclusions and recommendations. So because this was written in 1995, especially for folks that are, post Truth and Reconciliation and using terms like Indigenous, like this has older style writing. But for me, because I am Northern Slavey Dene, like literally I have family members that are written in this book. And so, and it's interesting because the very start, they have it in Dene, and I can't read any of it because of like forced cultural assimilation, basically. So it is a very short read. So it's only not even 130. Yeah, it's 132 pages. And, I hope that from folks who have spoke that you feel compelled to want to read this. But I again want to give perspective. Like at this time, I think Darcy had just got a electronic typewriter, so you could like pre-program a whole sentence in a typewriter. And so we would write our resumes with this like new cool electronic typewriter that would help us make less mistakes, just to give you an idea of the time where computers were just starting to get integrated into business. And so like when I think about that moment in time when we didn't have internet and such, and in here are just some great pictures, and I think like I wonder if they had any idea that this would be something that we could talk about the way we talk about it now. Anyway, so I tried to look to see if there were like some videos that we could show, and I actually didn't find anything that I thought would be of relevant here. So I just wanted to maybe take a little piece of it and read it to folks. But they did have this part that I really liked in chapter 2, doing things the right way, the way you were taught, rules for stewardship and maintaining relationships among people, animals, plants, and the spirits. And there's a little bit of Dene writing in it as well. But like literally it talks about basically like what we're doing when based off of the season, right? And I think about that a lot because when I do go up north, the biggest thing that is different to me, well, there's a million different things that are different from being in Calgary, but the big thing is the sun. So in the summer, the sun is there and it only sets for like 2 hours. But in the winter, you only see the sun for like 2 hours. So, your day is really set up based off of that to start with, right? And so this cycle talks about, you can go hunting for moose, caribou, rabbit, fish, or get firewood anytime. That, like, we're centered around that. And then so it talks about ice breaking up between May and June. So this would be things that you would be thinking about where you probably have to canoe. And if you better be a good water person if you are. When the water and sun are warm in June and August. And I mean, just to put it in perspective, like today in Calgary, it was like 17 degrees and it was a nice reprieve for the last 2 days that were like 26. Like it was hot. And my daughter and I were dying. Like, we're like, this is too hot for us. We're dying. Actually going to die. And my daughter was like, well, we're not going to make it to the end of the school year. The summer is going to be like, we're dying. And we had a little bit of forest fire too. So in my world, in my personal life, I'm worried about my family. They were all evacuated last summer and they never wanted to come on the podcast to talk about that experience. And now we're on standby again, waiting to see what else is going to happen. My brother, he's been living with me for almost 2 years now in my basement, but he was living in Fort McMurray and they're on standby for evacuation. So, like, it's funny because if we were to update this book, we'd have to account for wildfires. Wildfire season would be when the water is warm. But which isn't true. Like, it's always wildfire time up there too. So then when it gets darker in August and September, 5, when the wind gets cool and when the moose meets its mates between September and October, and then freeze up in October and November. And then when the days are short from November to February. And I'm like, that's a nice way to write it. But it breaks it down, the resource rules about, what to expect when. And you kind of have to live your life by this. You have to decide what you're doing when, and when you're going to do it throughout the year. So, and I think about it's kind of the same thing what you were alluding to there, Marla, where we're talking about ways of knowing a different Indigenous cultures, like winter count. That's, when the Blackfoot would do the winter count, right? So these are things that I thought about when I was kind of reading through this, and also thinking about the language barrier between the Dene and English, and the untrustworthiness of it, of trying to engage with another professor. Because for folks who don't know, like, so it was funny because one of the first things that said here is that Dene weren't assigned reserves. I'm like, well, that's bullshit, because, and so I was thinking about my own. So I'm Yellowknife Dene, and I can't remember what year it was. It was like 62 or something. These two profs from Wisconsin had come up and said, oh, there's no Dene here in Yellowknife anymore. And I'm like, how would you have come to that conclusion in any capacity? Like, I would, like, I don't know, like, were you stoned? Like, how did you feel comfortable as anthropologists writing that in textbooks? So anyway, when my granny was done with her residential schools, she was assigned Yellowknife Dene as her res. And so that's why I'm Yellowknife Dene. So, like, even that, like, there were things here that kind of contradicted itself that I didn't quite understand. So and to also give perspective, I don't quite understand Indian affairs when it comes to status at all. Just not point blank, I don't get it. Because I remember when I turned 18 was when then I would get a picture ID. So I was assigned a number, my Indian status number. And then when I turned 18, it was my responsibility to go to Edmonton and get my photo to them and all of this ID to get my status card. So, which I still have, like, to this day, the same one. And then it was supposed to be my responsibility when I married my husband to update it to the new last name. And I was like, I'm not going out to Edmonton. This is stupid. And I never did it. So now here I am in 2024, 3 or 4 years after trying to get my daughter her status. Barrier after barrier, delay after delay. And all I keep thinking is this: if I go up to Edmonton and I get a brand new status card with my brand new Robinson name, even though we've been married for 30 years, and and will then the process for my daughter go quicker? Like, because they have had my marriage certificate multiple times since we got married, in order to prove it's me. So I will never understand why there's no accountability in Indian affairs. So bringing it back to this was written in 1995. That would have been around the time that I got my status card itself, the little picture one. And so like it's just interesting to me because like she's talking about me without talking about me. So and I have family members in this book talking, and me being so just so removed from it, so disconnected to this, right? And so the little things I do know, they actually don't make sense, some of the things that are in here. It was a rule that territories had to be shared. There was no rigid hunting and trapping boundaries, so one could meet other hunters and trappers on the trail from as far south as Fort Providence, where my granny's residential school was, and as far north as Good Fort Hope, which was actually where my great grandmother died. And that's where my grandmother was transferred to Fort Providence. And that's where my great grandfather lived, was Fort Good Hope. However, it was a concept of Dogrib territory that made it important for the Dogribs to host people from other Dene groups entering their area. So like I think about the Northern Slavey, the South Slavey, the Chippewan, and the Dogrib, and how we all have our different areas when I think about that. This meant that the traveler was welcome to one's food and tent, and if he had dogs, they too were fed. It was a courtesy among trappers to let others know that they were crossing each other's lines. So again, I'm from the Hare people, right? So we would have had rabbits along our trap lines, if we had trap lines. I don't even know. As far as I understood, both my great grandparents were loggers, as far as I know. But there's so much I don't know because I'm so disconnected from it. So I just found it interesting reading some of these things. Fishing is big. Fishing is not big for Blackfoot. Like they'd starve to death before they'd eat fish, because they have this like strong belief of eating hoofed animals. So like as Dede, we're like, why wouldn't you just eat the fish? They're right there. They're right there. And I love fish. I love seafood. I all foods that are related to the water. I love eating them. Gathering. Everyone had the right to gather berries in any area. However, it was often most job of women and the children. Senior men and women also collected plants for healing. Gifts were left in appreciation with the earth's willingness to provide medicine. So I think about that today. How many of you know, like, oh, if you're picking sage, you put down some tobacco, you thank them. Like that's just a nice little sentence to kind of encapsulate it. So the gifts consisted of tobacco, matches, shells, and sometimes bannock. That's for the little people, and sugary stuff is for the little people, if you believe in that. Most men and women, and if you don't believe in it, your keys are going missing tomorrow, I promise. Most men and women know how to use traditional plants for everyday illness. However, if they didn't work, a person with special gift was called to help cure a person who was ill. Yeah, a lot of our spiritual leaders really helped people get better. What happened to people who broke the rules? I did read this part, and it was funny they used the word reconciliation. I'm like, they were talking about reconciliation before it was cool. Some people did not follow the rules and were dealt with in a variety of ways. Some offenses were minor and some major. Minor offenses were dealt with by the senior male within the small camps. Major ones required a gathering and a public admission of guilt, restitution, and a process of reconciliation. A minor offense might be a small theft. For example, elders reported when youth stole some bannock, they were ridiculed and shamed. The person for whom they stole would pin the bannock on their jacket, and everyone in the camp would know they'd stolen it and would laugh at them. Now, you all know Native humor, right? Do you not see how that might be kind of originated together there? I don't know. This was considered to be a deterrent, and it was unlikely the youth would repeat his or her theft because they did not want to face ridicule again. The more serious offense, but not major one, would be left to an animal from a trap. Would be the would be the theft of an animal from the trap. This offense would be reported to the headman in camp, and they have a term for that. And he would then speak harsh words to that person who had stolen the fur, and the thief would be asked to acknowledge his theft and return the fur or one of more equal value to the person from whom it was stolen. If the offender refused to do this, senior people gathered and confronted him. He was placed in the center of the circle, and people gave him harsh words about his inappropriate actions. So I think about all the elders here that always say, well, when people screwed up, we just sit down and talk to them and educate them. That's what I like. She keeps saying harsh words, and that's what I keep thinking is actually kind of being said here is like that moment of teaching, like, you know better, what's going on here, what's the problem. They demanded that he acknowledge his guilt and promise to return the fur. This stressed the importance of restoring harmony within the community, reconciliation with the person he had offended, and compensation through replacement of the fur. Once that was done, no further action was taken, no further mention of the offense. And I do remember later when they were talking about alcoholism, so I wasn't really excited to talk about that for kind of all the reasons that Marla really spoke about. But it says here, reconciliation was a key factor. Once harmony was restored by public acknowledgement of guilt, by returning the stolen article, reconciliation was achieved by the end incident. It is, no further mention of the matter was made. It could be construed as forgiveness. And I like the way they said that, construed. It's like you don't really forgive, you just make it work, right? So, conclusions. We have seen that the Dogrib had quite a clear system of justice in traditional hunting and trapping times. The component parts were one, there was a clear set of rules that were designed to maintain harmony within the society between the natural, animal, and human worlds. The rules were often taught by one generation to the next and enforced by daily instruction, observation, and expectations of proper behavior. Offenses ranged from slight to major, and the most serious being mistreatment of game. Can you imagine if that was your most serious offense? Why would you steal the hair? I don't know. This is going to be talked about until we have full harmony and reconciliation. I love it. The senior members dealt with offenses. They judged the offense and determined what remedial actions were to be taken. Serious offenses, there were public admission of guilt and a collective group speaking in harsh words to the offender who had committed his action. Like, seriously, you guys have been to how many Indigenous rallies? How many times have we had harsh words for some of our people that we have been offended by? Thinking of Calgary police right now. Once guilt was admitted, we've never been there. And appropriate remedial actions were defined by the group. The individual had to restore harmony and reconcile with the person he or she had offended. Failure to comply resulted in shunning and on occasion banishment. Once the offender had met all the instructions for restoration and harmony and restitution and reconciliation, he or she were forgiven. That is, the incident was not mentioned again. So I like the way it's kind of said a few times in different ways that it's not really a forgiveness issue. It's more of a, okay, we dealt with it, we're moving on now. And you better know better. Where was I? There was no concept of not guilty, nor was there any way of appealing the judgment of the community. While senior men and women took part in speaking harsh words and making decisions about remedial action, all people in the community were present as observers and all adults could speak. In the following chapter, we turn to the finding on rules for living together, that is family law, which addresses how children learn the rules from socialization, rules for marriage, rules for relationship between men and women, special rules for women, and how offenses were dealt with. So yeah, does anyone want to talk about any of that? Yeah, go ahead, Kat.
I liked that in this system, a person takes responsibility and restitution is made.
Yeah.
Right there. I mean, the community is small enough that everybody knows you did it, right? So you can't squirm out of it. But yeah, you have to take responsibility for it and repair the harms, and that has to, as the book said, has to a lot to do with the survival. It all of these rules have to do with survival of the group. So harmony had to be maintained.
Right.
How amazing would that be today? I mean, there's just too many people in the city to even think about getting this type of system going for non-Dene people.
Yeah.
But it seems like a better way because the person admits their guilt and they make amends for it.
Mm-hmm.
And everybody knows what happened and they just, get on with living with
yeah.
it.
Yeah. I found this really interesting how women were teenage girls and women on their period. They call it menses here. One of the goals of isolation was to make sure that men were safe from the effects of female power, considered to be very strong and symbolized by blood. Woman's blood could move game away from the area if she walked on their trails or on the hunters' trails, even if blood were not handled properly when the women were in camp and the men were on the trap line. The hunter or trapper could be affected negatively and not get any game. This could in turn affect the group's survival. Yeah. I'm just gonna, do you want me to pause it?
I'm so sorry. No, that someone's there's goslings trying to get out of a pond and people are crowding around them. I didn't realize I was unmuted. I'm so sorry.
That's fine. Would you like to introduce yourself at all to the crowd?
Absolutely. I do apologize.
No, it's fine. It's fine.
My name is Aiden. I am a white settler. Well, I guess actually settler colonist, I think, is what the official title would be. But I am first off very honored to be here and listening to you guys and your voices, and I thank you very much for having me here. I am a poli-sci student at the University of Calgary, and I guess that's pretty much it.
Well, we're glad you're here. So thanks for being here, Aiden.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, you're welcome. Yeah, so death was well known. There were several reports of stillborn babies and some babies dying shortly after birth. That was a real thing in my family too, actually. There are many more stories of people dying of injuries, disease, and hunger. When people died, it affected the whole community because relationships were close. There were no wills and little property. Spouses kept the property of the deceased and passed appropriate items to adult children, who sometimes took on the roles of the departed family members. Sons and daughters received their fathers and mothers' tools, equipment for hunting, etc. Personal clothing was burned. Occasionally, a man's rifle was burned with him. The burning took place on the day of the burial, and it is reported that the smoke enabled the deceased person's soul to travel to a comfortable resting space. There was some fun in adulthood as well. People would talk about the enjoyment of summer fish and berry camps, of feasts and the festivities after the missionaries came and after treaty. They spoke of jokes they played on each other and of the yearly spring shamans games. I'm like, and some reported the excitement of possibly seeing a bushman or experiencing other things happening that were extraordinary. They didn't say it, but Naga is what down south we call Bigfoot or Sasquatch. Naga is the word for me, for Satu Dene. And so, yeah, we truly do. I've had my experiences as well. So as people began to age, the elders were treated with respect and caring. No longer able to set up the trap lines or walk long distances, elders began to enjoy the benefits of having raised many kids who would bring them meat and fish and wood. There is a balance, not always ideal because the death rate was high, but a balance nevertheless between people, the land, the animals, and spirits. As long as the balance was maintained, life went on, and people were relatively safe, healthy, and active. This disruption of this balanced life cycle and seasonal round came from the outside. With the arrival of non-Dene and Deneta, life changed drastically, and many imbalances came into play, which will be discussed later in the chapter. And talks about adoption, and there's a bit of a summary about rules of marriages had to be arranged. They required the consent of parents and elders, and acknowledgement of the union had to be public. Yeah, so men were the bosses of women, and women had to obey men. Domestic violence is a real thing, and I don't know how to really talk about that, but I will say that my daughter's the first one to not be raised with an angry father beating the shit out of her. So I'm just happy that that's real. Women's roles were mainly productive and reproductive. They bore children, made camp, dried meat and fish, tanned hides, sewed and cooked. And I'm like, interesting. Men were allowed to hit women if they were just in cause. This was written in 1995, and I just wanted to give perspective for folks. In 1995, I thought it was totally acceptable for men to be hitting women because that's what I was raised in. That's what I'd seen all my friends to be raised in. And I was just trying to learn a bit about feminism and understanding how, you know what, it might actually be wrong. This was seen to affect the whole community when a just cause was determined by community standards and related mainly to a woman's failure to equip and provide sufficiently for her husband's hunting and trapping trips. And like domestic abuse is rampant up north. My daughter sometimes has very, like, I don't know if romantic is the right word, but she has a yearning to go back up north to where we belong. And like even the RCMP are, still busy raping our women and such too. And the community won't speak up. The community is very Catholic, very Christian. And so this just kind of fits in their world, and I don't like it at all. So I do have a hard time wanting to be up there, knowing how, even according to this book, it's okay to hit women, right? And it's not okay to hit women. I don't know why somewhere we gave permission for that. And I wonder if in 1995 they had written this, not deconstructing what Christianity had done to my people and why, because like I just can't believe that it was okay to always hit women. So anyway, women were responsible for the safety of men, trails, games through the control of their strong power symbolized by blood. There were many rituals, rules that they had to follow to make sure that their blood did not negatively affect the survival. Separation of married partners was not culturally acceptable and was allowed only under rare circumstances. The decision was made by the community in consultation with elders. Orphan children were adopted by mothers' relatives. Children were taught by both parents and grandparents. It was important for everything, the rules to be passed down. Children were expected to follow rules, especially young adults. And yeah, I don't know. There was always an emphasis on maintaining a balance between human, natural, animal, plant, and spiritual worlds. In some, they were the right ways of doing things for living together. And yeah, I didn't feel comfortable reading all of that because I'm literally an advocate against violence against Indigenous women, and this sucks to read. because it's like I don't believe that. And I do know that my granny, she did not believe in divorcing my grandfather, and so they did live separately. He lived in a home, and she lived with my mother and my uncle until she died, and wouldn't divorce him, even though I would argue she should have, but that wasn't what they believed, and they were Catholic as well as, that's obviously a sign of the times. It was just okay for men to beat the shit out of their wives, and I don't believe in that. So either I'm rejecting my ways, or I reject that book as misconstrued of what has happened over colonial, like the violence of colonialism, that was written in 1995 about Dene people. So yeah, does anybody want to reflect on any of that?
I think I can't comment on that, but I think the one thing that she does in the book around that, and also sexual violence against girls and women, is say that it's really no better in settler society, that, so if you're going to read this and pass judgment on the Dene community, you better take a look in your own backyard first, because
well, and again, how do we determine that wasn't taught by settlers?
right. Yeah, we don't know.
Yeah. So I really struggled with that, reading that and being like, we're talking about that because, as you all know, like I just have no time and patience for violence against women. And so am I really going to let my daughter go back up north where it is rampant for the community to be like, yeah, no, it's totally cool. I know what that was like growing up in the 80s and 90s. And I don't want that for them in any capacity. So yeah. Any other reflections, folks?
I was just thinking about two things. When Marla, you referenced how there'd be individual interviews and then they had to compromise and have like group interviews. And I know when Joan was involved with the research project among the Gwich'in, the researchers, they all went out, they all interviewed elders, and then they came back and they said, well, we're just not getting any more information. That's it. And she said, oh, okay, let's think about that. So she suggested that they have a tea for the elders. So they had a series of teas where they brought the elders together, and then the researchers would, pose something, right, from the research results so far. And then the discussion grew so much richer because the elders were all feeding off of each other and remembering different things. So that can be a positive thing rather than a compromise. And when it comes, you're right. I'm thinking, why didn't Joan talk more about colonialism in that book? Because I know when she was working with the Lubicon, she was very clear that issues such as alcohol abuse, domestic violence, have very much emerged from the disruption, right, of the society. Oil and gas companies come in, you destroy traditional hunting, trapping, and gathering ways of life. And again, that was so traumatic for people within the community and for men who lost their roles of providing for the family. And yeah, also you build a road, alcohol is easier to access. But it definitely symptomatic of trauma, but she didn't name it that. She didn't call it trauma, right? But she did talk about, and she didn't talk about colonialism, but she was very aware of the disruption and the destruction of many traditional ways of doing things.
She just kind of alludes to it, right? Like, so that's why it's so important to say it. Like she would say before contact, before the non-Dene, right? So I really like the way she framed it in 1995. Like that's a tough time to be talking like this.
Yeah. And then I also keep thinking, oh boy, I think the 90s was the time. Do any of you remember a film called The Alkali Lake Indian Band from BC? Does that ring a bell with anybody?
Not me, sorry.
So it was about a community where a chief was elected who just wanted to take the issue of alcohol abuse head on. And he and a few others worked so hard to do that. And they imposed laws about people not being able to, people come in and sell liquor, et cetera, et cetera. And, but what was interesting is that they were quite successful. And as part of the success of, people deal with the alcohol abuse, and then they're going, wow, it doesn't actually say why they were abusing alcohol, almost as a self-medication thing. But once it was removed, then it was, okay, where is our traditional culture? Where is our language? Where is the way we used to do things? Where are the jobs, right? So again, it alludes to a destruction of traditional ways of doing things. And so the film was great about the film is it talked in the end about bringing in people from the surrounding areas to reintroduce culture and language and spirituality and get jobs into the community. But what's very interesting is that after that film was made, several years later, there's another film about the same community. And the other issue that surfaced was the whole issue of child abuse within the community. And again, with the removal of the alcohol, right? People are really paying attention and going, wow. So they actually brought in a team of healers from, I think was the Neche Institute here in Alberta.
Yeah.
To work with people in the community. And of course, what's revealed is that people who were abusers had all been abused in residential school.
Yeah.
Right. So it was that pattern, that got established through that. And the emphasis was on healing everybody, right? Like you work with the young people who've been abused, but you also work with the abusers because they needed healing too from the past. So it just showed how complex these issues are. And it was directly put to the residential schools. Yeah.
Yikes. I thought maybe if I could Google it, I could find it in time, but I can't. So that's okay. That's okay.
Rosemary, Joan does talk about the Alkali Lake.
Oh, does she?
Yeah, and the Neche Institute as well in the book. So she does mention that as well.
Good. So it was in that time frame. Yeah. When
Good
you get
memory.
older, what happened when?
No, it's a good memory. I thought I saw Aiden's hand up, so I just wanted to. And Samantha, if you have something you'd like to say, please don't hesitate to chime in. Okay, no one's unmuting themselves, so that's okay.
Well,
oh, there we go.
Yeah, I really found it interesting to hear that after someone would pass away, that they would burn their clothes, and that the smoke was seen as would help the person transition to the spirit world. And I have been thinking a lot about rituals around death and dying and what capitalism has done, and not just capitalism, but colonialism has done to our rituals around that. And that's a whole big topic, but to specifically, I think that the more that I'm learning about colonialism, the more I'm discovering the details of the trauma of what it means to take away a person's ability
and ritual to exist. And so, you know, gathering your ability to feed yourself, but your ability to mourn, your ability to take care of children, basically like culture. I'm learning more about how culture sustains us and allows us to live a life where our souls are are healthy, you know, and to think of, I'm just learning more ways that taking away those different aspects of the culture, the harm that leaves behind, the trauma that leaves behind, and the government's refusal to acknowledge it and to accept and listen to the really specific, detailed feedback and requests that Indigenous communities are making for all those areas. So yeah, I think that part specifically stood out to me, and I found myself curious to know more about what traditional practices of mourning were for the Dene people and maybe other nations, and how those have been impacted by colonialism and capitalism, and what impact that has had on them.
I can tell you, every full moon I do a sacred fire, and I just try to let go. And I think there's something inherent there that I don't understand. So I just been learning as much as I can. And like my understanding is that every family had their own fire. Obviously, they had their sacred fire, their smoking fire, their fire, and so like all of it's been taken from me. Like I won't know. And you know, my mom is Catholic, right? Proudly Catholic, like die hard Catholic. So yeah, it's hard because when I read a book like this, it's like, okay, so this is a white person misinterpreting you know, Christianity that's been imposed for the last 100 years on my people. So now we beat our wives and that's okay. And it's like, oh, this doesn't feel right. So I think it's important to read it regardless, because it's very accessible and available, this book. It's I found a copy in Ferris Fair, I don't know if a year ago, 2 years ago, but it's been sitting there for me to go through and to try to critique it. But the truth is, I would probably, because one of the things I Googled was critique of, because I wanted to know if one of my cousins had critiqued this book at a scholarly level yet, because with the deepest respect, you know, to Joan Ryan, rest in peace, and she did good work at her time. You know, I think of Tom Flanagan obviously being the extreme, and I know Indigenous people have made their lives just debunking his work. And so I think of like, it's not that this needs to be debunked, but that, you know, like today we have the First Nation Information Governance Center that talks about the OCAP principles, the ownership, control, access, and possession. So like, if I were to take this back to community and go, what is right, what is wrong about this book, and talk to them about it, like that's what I want to do. That's the truth. I want to Google critique of and title of this book and Joan Ryan, and I want there to be videos. I want there to be, you know, scholarly pieces that have been done to give context to what it is we're reading, because you know, really short read, and that I found that in the 90s, that 90s books, and I meant to go to the CBC's book show for this reason, you know, grab a bunch of the older books that are basically, you know, oh, these drunk natives, you know, and have that type of language and that type of sentiment, and just kind of take those and try to debunk them, because I think it's really important that we put that language of colonial trauma, missing culture. This is, you know, not addressed in this book or that book or whatever book you pick up and talk about it from that lens. But she does a good job of trying to say, like, you know, prior to contact with non-Dene, etc. So, you know, that's kind of what I took from it. Aiden, I just wanted to give you an opportunity to unmute yourself if you wanted as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. Sorry about that. I had someone come over and talk to me when I was about to unmute earlier.
That's okay.
But I so I have very, very limited knowledge on the DNA, just kind of like in general. So I'm not going to speak on the culture in that regard and any in-depth analysis, but from what I'm hearing about the way that Joan was discussing abuse within the community, specifically targeted against women, it sparked imagery of um, past knowledge I've had about kind of accepting something as normalized as a coping mechanism. So deciding that, it's always been this way. This is just how it is. It's how it's going to be forever. It's natural. As a way for people to, especially specifically victims, to rationalize in their brain the abnormality of the situation. See that, this is not normal. It's not natural to hurt the people who care. It's not natural to hurt out of frustration and rage, especially when you can take into account that if I hurt someone I care about, intentionally or unintentionally, it makes me feel bad afterwards, reflecting on it, because I've caused someone I care about pain. So in and of itself, that intrinsically to humans tells me that that's not natural. So to come up with something that excuses that, I very much a sign of the times. I'm quite young, so I wasn't alive in the 90s. I can't really attest to the culture of the 90s, but even then, it sounds like there's acknowledgement that this is abnormal behavior, but an unwillingness to acknowledge it for fear that you have to then address the problem and try to find a solution that isn't easy to come through, and that's what I'm hearing, especially from your experience as a Dene. Do you identify as a woman? I didn't.
I do. Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
Your experience.
I'm as straight as cis and heterosexual as it gets, and I've been unpacking, unhealthy sexuality since my 20s, and obviously really fall into the gay community as a result of my daughter, and other family members identifying as queer. But it's been interesting because even this morning we had a BIPOC community gathering, and we were talking about being, once you're in an atmosphere that kind of decolonizes sexuality and that unhealthiness, when you're in one that is unhealthy, you're like, wow, this is like black and white, night and day different for me. So so that's a bit about me. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, and I can attest to that as well. But that I myself was raised in a not on my mother's side, but in a somewhat hostile environment. And hearing how you described that, like, yeah, it's pinpoint what you said. Your experiences of being a woman. It is your lived experience, and talking about how the culture was just normalized. It was just a normal thing. It was as if you're walking on the sidewalk and it's just, oh, it's always been concrete here. It's always been pavement. It's never, this has never been Greenland. It's always been this. It makes it uh it makes it very hard to move past. And
Well, and just to add to that, so a great example is I remember trying to talk to my mom about, like I was trying to talk about teepees. I was trying to get from her what she knew about teepees and the teachings, because the Stony do it differently than the Blackfoot. The Blackfoot really have these like four main poles that they use to build a teepee with, and then others use like three as their structure, and then you add to it. And so I was like, I wonder what the Denes is. And so I went to talk to my mom, and she literally talked like there was never teepees. Like, well, I don't know what you're talking about. There's always been buildings by the government. And I'm like,
Wow.
kind of add to what you're saying there. Yeah.
Well, and I appreciate that a lot. That is the greatest example of what I was trying to get across. Like that is, it's systemic, and it becomes habitual. And I know the term intergenerational trauma has been thrown out quite a bit recently here in the past couple of years, but that is, it's cultural trauma that passes down. And you see it pretty much everywhere. I think that a lot of the discussion doesn't really do the problem justice of looking at it like, is this something we can overcome? More so, is this something that, or how is this something we can overcome? How is this something we can just completely move through and then acknowledge that it happened and that it was a part of the culture that we lived in, while still understanding it's not acceptable and appreciating that it shaped who we are and who our parents were and who our ancestors were up until this point.
Oh, thanks for sharing that. I really appreciate that. All right, folks, I just want to do one last wrap up on the book, and then maybe we'll pause it for further discussion. Anybody else want to add anything else to the book that before we wrap up? Okay, all right. Thanks, folks, for enjoying this book with me and talking like almost in a nostalgic way of what it was like in 1995 and pre-internet. I appreciate that, folks.